They said women behind a sniper rifle were liabilities. Not assets, not saviors. Liabilities. Talia Grant had read those words so many times they were etched behind her eyelids. They'd been stamped on an evaluation report 3 years ago, signed by a man who believed biology decided bravery, that a woman's heartbeat could never steady enough to thread a bullet through a hurricane, that she would crumble before the weight of a mission or hesitate when a single second meant life or death. And now, under the ghost-pale light of a half-hidden moon, fate had dragged those words back to the surface. Because the man who wrote them was 2 kilometers away, surrounded, pinned, and screaming for help. The Hindu Kush swallowed everything sound, light, hope. The mountains rose like jagged black teeth against the night, and in the cracks between them, death hunted in silence. On the ridge, 11,000 feet above sea level, a single figure lay prone against the frozen ground, the steel of her rifle biting into her shoulder. Talia adjusted her cheek weld against the stock, the faint hum of wind threading through her hair as she peered down the length of her loopled Mark 6 scope. Her breath came slow, deliberate. In, out, in, out. She let the world narrow until there was nothing but glass, reticle, and target. The target was a voice, a broken, panicked voice clawing through the static on an emergency frequency. Trident 301, requesting immediate fire support. Then silence, only the hiss of dead air. No one was answering. For 41 minutes, the SOS had gone unanswered. The quick reaction force was still 40 minutes out. Air support was grounded by a storm brutal enough to chew the blades off a helicopter. And the only sniper close enough to reach them, the only one with eyes on the valley, was the same soldier they had once called unfit to serve beside them. She could have ignored it. She wasn't under contract to assist them. She wasn't under anyone's command anymore. She could have let them hold on until help arrived, or not at all. But that wasn't who Talia was. The rifle cradled in her arms wasn't standard issue. It was a custom bolt-action beast built on a Remington 700 frame, chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum, a round designed to reach across valleys and tear through distance like it was paper. It was a rifle meant for the impossible, and it was more than metal and powder. It was legacy. Talia had learned to shoot before she'd learned to drive, before she'd even learned to dance. Her grandmother, Margaret Hale, had put a rifle in her hands on a Montana hillside and told her that shooting was never about strength. It was about patience, control, breath. It was about slowing the world down until the shot fired itself. "Don't fight the wind," Margaret used to say. "Feel it, listen to it, become part of it." Margaret had been one of 12 women snipers trained in a forgotten Korean War program, ghosts hidden in classified files until decades later. And from her, Talia inherited more than skill. She inherited a creed, calm in the chaos, precision in the storm. That creed had carried her from the ranch to the University of Montana, where physics textbooks shared space with shooting trophies. 3 national long-range championships. Recruitment into the Army's sniper school at Fort Benning. Distinguished honor graduate, one of 4 women to survive the crucible that broke most men. Her instructors said she could read the wind with her skin, feel the density of air like a second sight. But skill meant little against prejudice. Even after she proved herself in the Derrick Valley, 6 days, 17 confirmed kills, a platoon held together by her trigger finger, the doors stayed locked. She earned the call sign Avenger after a 1,623-meter shot that stopped an enemy sniper cold. But promotions stalled, opportunities vanished, and evaluations like Nathan Cole's followed her like ghosts. Women can't carry the weight, women can't detach, women can't survive Tier 1 missions. And now those same men were dying. Contractor Overwatch, Alpha Ridge 77, I've got eyes on your grid. The silence that followed was heavier than the mountains themselves. Then, a breath, sharp, startled, crackled through the headset. Talia. Even over comms, she recognized the voice. Nathan Cole, the SEAL commander who had written her out of a future she'd bled for. And now he was calling into the void, his voice stripped bare of arrogance, trembling on the edge of panic. Two men down, mortars closing in, snipers dead, we're boxed in. Talia's jaw tightened. She flipped open her Kestrel 5700 ballistic meter. Wind, 18 to 25 knots. Full crosswind. Temperature degrees C. Air density low. Every factor was against her. Every shot would be a razor's edge calculation. Perfect. Through her thermal optic, the world burned in ghostly shapes, patches of heat moving against the darkness. Her crosshairs hovered over the faint glow of a machine gun nest, 1,047 meters out. The range card etched itself into her mind. Elevation, wind drift, spin drift, Coriolis effect. A ballet of physics and patience. She exhaled, squeezed. The rifle thundered. A heartbeat later, the gun nest went dark. Hit confirmed. Jesus Christ, that was. A SEAL's voice erupted over comms, disbelief giving way to relief. Talia didn't answer. She was already working the bolt, chambering the next round. 1,062 meters. Mortar team, adjust wind. Recalculate density, altitude. Another shot, another hit, silence. But the enemy was learning. Tracer rounds slashed through the night, clawing toward her ridge. Rock chips stung her cheek. She rolled sideways, shifting position, disappearing into the jagged stone before they could zero in. A new threat appeared. A sniper, their sniper, hidden in a cave 1,230 meters out, beyond her cartridge's design. Wind howled at 35 knots now, gusting hard enough to turn a bullet's path into chaos. At that distance, the shot would take nearly 3 seconds to land, an eternity in combat. 3 seconds where anything could change. She waited, watched. The enemy's muzzle flashed, a shot that slammed into dirt meters from Cole's men. Then a pause as the silhouette shifted, cycling the bolt. Now. Elevation, 14 mils. Windage, 6 downslope adjustment, timing the gusts, anticipating his rhythm. She fired. 3 seconds stretched into forever, then the shape folded, gone. Enemy sniper down. Immediate suppression grid NC-47, Cole's voice snapped, clipped, professional. But the relief beneath it was undeniable. She had 18 rounds left. The quick reaction force was 23 minutes out, and dozens of enemy fighters were closing in, fanning through the valley like wolves around wounded prey. Every shot meant exposing herself. Every muzzle flash was a flare in the night. They're in the dead space, we can't hit them. Dead space. The cruelest terrain, invisible from the SEAL's angle but open to hers. 12 fighters slipping through shadows, 30 seconds from overrunning the valley floor. 700 meters, moving targets, high wind. The instructors at Bennying called it theoretical shooting. Shots no sane sniper would attempt. Talia smiled. She closed her eyes and listened. The wind roared and screamed, then paused, a heartbeat of silence. She fired. 1 down. She waited, another breath of silence. 2 down. She moved with the gusts, weaving instinct with math. 5, 6, 7. Panic rippled through the enemy ranks as bodies dropped one by one. 8, 9, 10. 90 seconds, 12 targets, 12 shots. The assault shattered before it began. On the horizon, rotor blades thumped against the dawn. Apache escorts tore into the mountainside with cannon fire, carving the darkness into flame. The quick reaction force swept in, and Nathan Cole's team, battered, bloodied, alive, was still breathing. The men who had called her a liability were alive because of her. But Talia didn't move, not yet. She stayed on that ridge for 6 more hours, her rifle steady, overwatch unbroken, until the last wounded SEAL was lifted out of danger. She didn't do it for thanks, or vindication, or redemption. She did it because it was the right thing to do. Because in the cold, in the silence, in the chaos, that's who she was. and somewhere deep down, she knew the world would never see her the same way again. 3 days later, a message arrived, encrypted, formal. Nathan Cole had revised his evaluation. He admitted his prejudice. His words had been theory, not truth. He recommended her for a civilian commendation and asked if she would consider training his sniper section. Talia declined. She had no interest in training men who had once doubted her, but she accepted something else. That December, she walked into a SEAL Team 7 reunion as an invited guest. Cole met her at the door, his men behind him. The young operator who had cried for his mother over the radio stood alive before her, eyes filled with gratitude he couldn't put into words. Cole handed her a plaque. Honorary Member, Trident 31. Beneath it, an inscription, for the guardian angel who answered when no one else could. And as she held the weight of that plaque, steel and oak and everything it meant, she felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not even vindication. Something deeper. A door opening, a path forward, a truth too long buried rising to the surface. Because sometimes dignity doesn't roar, it doesn't demand, it doesn't ask for permission. Sometimes dignity simply acts and changes everything. The snow had melted into spring by the time she saw him again. Red Haven was just beginning to breathe after another bitter Montana winter, the pastures softening, the wind carrying the scent of pine and thawing earth. Life here moved slower, quieter, a place where a rifle shot echoed for miles and no one called it violence. They called it life. They called it balance. Talia Grant had traded battlefields for open fields. But some nights, as the sky stretched violet over the plains and the coyotes howled in the distance, her mind still drifted back to the ridge, to the muzzle flashes, the desperate voices, the weight of 23 lives balanced on the cold steel of her trigger. She told herself she was done with that world, that she had walked away for good. But the truth was, the war hadn't walked away from her. The envelope came on a Tuesday, plain brown, no return address, just a single line scrawled across the back in black ink. "We need to talk." Inside was a set of coordinates, a date, and a time, nothing else. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar. Nathan Cole. For a long moment she just stared at it, the muscles in her jaw tightening. She had no reason to see him, nothing to gain, but something in her chest, curiosity, unfinished business, maybe even forgiveness, tugged her toward the decision she swore she'd never make. 3 days later, she was standing in the shadow of an old hangar on the edge of Falcon Ridge Airfield. Cole was already there. Time had carved lines into his face that hadn't been there before, but the eyes were the same, sharp, commanding, and for the first time, uncertain. He wore civilian clothes now, though he still carried himself like a man with rank stitched into his skin. "Talia," he said, his voice quieter than she remembered. "Commander," she replied, keeping her hands in the pockets of her worn field jacket. He flinched at the title, and a long silence stretched between them before he spoke again. "You didn't have to come." "I almost didn't." He nodded, taking the blow without defense. "I know I owe you more than a plaque, more than a commendation. I didn't do it for you." "I know," he said softly. "That's why it means something." They stood there in the cool air, two people bound together by a night neither could forget. Cole finally exhaled and pulled a folder from the inside of his jacket. It was thicker than she expected. "These are after-action reports, recommendations. Some are mine, some are from command. It's all official now. The evaluation I wrote 3 years ago has been formally expunged. The record shows you as one of the highest-rated snipers to ever serve alongside special operations." Talia didn't reach for the folder. She just watched him, trying to read the man behind the words. "And that's not all," Cole continued. "Selection boards are rewriting their criteria, capability over gender, direct results over theoretical assessments. It's a start, A small one, but it's something. A part of her wanted to feel satisfaction, vindication. Instead, she just felt tired. "It's about time," she said quietly. "There's more," he said, hesitating now. "They're opening a pilot program, joint training between SEAL sniper elements and civilian contractors. I want you to lead it." The offer hung in the air like the first breath before a storm. She should have said no. It wasn't her fight anymore. She had carved out a life here far from the scrutiny, the politics, the endless proving of herself. And yet, something deep inside stirred. Not pride, purpose. "Why me?" she asked. "Because," Cole said, meeting her eyes, "they trust you now." She almost laughed. "Do they? Or do they just need a convenient symbol?" "Maybe both," he admitted. "But the truth is, they can't deny what you did, and they don't want the next Talia Grant to go through what you did." The wind picked up, brushing hair across her face. She looked past Cole to the horizon, where the mountains rose like old ghosts. Part of her longed for the simplicity of the shot, the clarity of a target, the precision of a mission. Another part wanted to bury it all beneath the soil of Red Haven and never look back. "Think about it," Cole said, breaking her thoughts. "No pressure, but if you say yes, you won't just be training shooters. You'll be shaping the future of this community." He turned to leave, but paused and glanced back over his shoulder. "And for what it's worth, I'm sorry, Talia, truly." She didn't answer, not then. That night she sat at her grandmother's old oak table, the one worn smooth by decades of shared meals and stories. Beside her lay two things: Margaret Hale's Korean War medal and the plaque from Cole's team. Side by side, they looked like a conversation between past and present, one earned in silence, the other born from defiance. Her fingers traced the etched words again and again. "For the guardian angel who answered when no one else could." She remembered the sound of that young SEAL's voice over the radio, calling for his mother. The way his team's panic had bled through the static, the weight of every trigger pull that had kept them alive. That wasn't about gender. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about doing what was right when no one else could. And maybe that was still her calling. The program launched 6 months later. It wasn't glamorous. There were no press releases, no ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Just a collection of shooters, some active duty, some contractors, gathered at an undisclosed range in the Nevada desert. Among them were the first two women ever approved to attempt SEAL sniper training. They were young, sharp, and hungry, and terrified. Talia saw it in their eyes as they approached her for the first time, the same mix of hope and fear she had once carried into Fort Benning. The same unspoken question: do I belong here? She gave them the only answer that had ever mattered. "You belong here because you showed up," she told them. "The rest is just physics and patience." Training days started before dawn and bled into the night. They shot in blistering heat and freezing wind, on static targets and moving silhouettes. They learned to calculate wind drift without instruments, to read mirage and terrain, to let the world slow until a single shot could change everything. Talia pushed them harder than anyone had pushed her, not because she wanted to break them, but because the world would. The world would question them, doubt them, try to tear them apart with whispers and evaluations and statistics written by men who had never felt a rifle kick against their shoulder. And when that day came, she wanted them ready. "Don't prove them wrong," she told the class one afternoon as the sun sank low over the range. "Prove yourselves right, because the shot isn't about them. It's about you." They listened, they learned, and slowly she watched them change. Hesitation turned to confidence, doubt turned to discipline, and by the end of the 12-week course the question in their eyes was, "Do I belong here anymore?" It was what's next. On the final day, Cole visited the range. He stood in the shade with his arms crossed, watching silently as Talia's students executed a complex long-range engagement under shifting crosswinds. Every hit was a small rebellion, every impact a crack in the wall that had once kept them out. They're good, Cole admitted quietly. They're better than good, Talia said. They're ready. He nodded, and for a moment there was nothing left between them but the wind and the distant echo of gunfire. You were right, he said finally. Capability over gender, it's the only measure that's ever mattered. I know, she replied, not looking at him. I always knew. He smiled a small, weary smile and walked away. And as she watched him go, Talia realized that this was what victory looked like. Not medals, not recognition, but change, real, tangible change. That night, as the desert cooled and the stars spilled across the sky, Talia stayed behind long after the others had left. She set up a single steel plate at 1,200 meters, dialed her scope, and took her position on the firing line. She breathed, listened, felt the wind brush against her cheek like an old friend. The shot broke clean and true, ringing against the distant steel. It wasn't about proving herself anymore. It wasn't about revenge or redemption or even legacy. It was about the quiet truth her grandmother had taught her all those years ago. The finest marksmen aren't the loudest or the strongest. They are the ones who can find stillness in the storm, the ones who can see clearly when the world around them turns to chaos. And sometimes, they are the ones no one ever sees coming, until the moment they change everything. Talia smiled to herself in the darkness, her rifle cooling in the night air. The war might never walk away from her, but maybe, just maybe, she had found a way to make peace with it. Because in the end, it wasn't about the shot that saved 20 men in a valley in Afghanistan. It wasn't even about the doors that shot had opened. It was about the future, the one she was building now, one student, one trigger pull, one quiet revolution at a time. The desert wind howled across the range, carrying with it the scent of spent powder and sun-baked earth. Training had ended hours ago, yet Talia remained prone behind her rifle, eyes fixed on the horizon as if searching for something beyond the steel plates and sand. Something inside her had shifted. The valley in Afghanistan had rewritten the story others told about her. The program in Nevada had begun to rewrite the story she told about herself. But deep down, Talia knew she was still standing in a space between past and future, between the ghosts of who she had been and the shadow of who she might become. She wasn't naive enough to think the fight was over. Prejudice didn't vanish overnight. Doors didn't stay open just because one bullet had blown them off their hinges. The struggle would continue in briefing rooms, in selection boards, in the quiet corners of conversation where old biases whispered loudest. But now, at least, she wasn't fighting alone. 3 weeks later, the call came. It was early morning, the sun barely peeking over the pine-dotted hills of Red Haven. Talia was mending a fence line on the ranch, hands calloused, boots caked with earth, when her satellite phone buzzed against her hip. She wiped the sweat from her brow, expecting a student or a contractor. Instead, the voice on the other end froze her where she stood. "Grant, this is Langley. CIA." The agent's tone was clipped, efficient, but beneath the formality was something she recognized: urgency. "There's a developing situation. Remote sector, Northern Balk Province. One of our surveillance teams is pinned down. 2 KIA, 3 wounded. They've gone dark except for a single encrypted burst. We're assembling an extraction element, but we need long-range overwatch." Talia's heart ticked faster. "You have other snipers closer." "We do," the voice admitted, "but they're not you." The line went quiet. A decision, simple and impossible, hung in the silence. She had promised herself she was done with field work, that her days of crawling through dirt and blood were behind her, but promises meant little when lives were on the line. "Send me the brief," she said. The mission moved fast. By nightfall, Talia was wheels up on a C-17 bound for Bagram Airfield. From there, a Black Hawk ferried her, and a small 4-man support team deep into the northern mountains. The op was classified beyond the usual layers: no names, no call signs. just a set of coordinates, a window of operation, and a grim satellite feed showing a small safe house surrounded by hostile movement. The team she was there to protect, 4 CIA field operatives and 2 Afghan National Directorate partners, had been gathering intel on a cross-border weapons network. The mission had gone sideways when local fighters, tipped off by a leak, descended on their location. Now they were trapped inside a half-collapsed structure with dwindling ammo and a steadily tightening noose. Talia's job was clear: hold the ridgeline, eliminate high-value threats, and keep the enemy pinned until extraction. It sounded simple on paper. It never was. They inserted under cover of darkness. The Black Hawk's rotor wash whipped sand and grit into the night as Talia and her team disembarked on a rocky slope 2 kilometers from the target site. Every step from there was on foot, steep, uneven terrain, the kind that punished lungs and knees and patience. By 300 they were in position, a jagged outcropping overlooking the valley below. Through the scope, the safe house appeared as a fractured shell of mud, brick, and concrete, barely holding together under the weight of relentless fire. Dozens of fighters ringed the structure, their muzzle flashes strobing against the darkness. Talia exhaled slowly, calibrating her mind to the mission. Wind, steady 15 knots from the west. Humidity low, temperature just above freezing. She built her firing solution in seconds, every variable slotting into place like a puzzle she'd solved 1,000 times before. The first shot broke the night. A sentry on the eastern ridge dropped, his body tumbling into shadow. The second shot silenced a machine gun crew pinning the safe house's northern wall. Each round stitched calm into chaos, buying seconds for the team below. "Overwatch, this is Echo 1, a strained voice crackled through the radio. "We've got eyes on you, whoever you are, thank you." She didn't reply. There was no need. They had no idea it was her, and that was fine. Anonymity was its own kind of freedom. For the next 4 hours, Talia became a ghost. She shifted firing positions twice, crawling belly down over jagged rock to avoid counter-sniper detection. She changed her angles, altered her rhythm, forced the enemy to question where death was coming from. At 1,100 meters, she neutralized a mortar team preparing to level the safe house's last standing wall. At 1,340, she punched a shot through a narrow window and ended a commander rallying fighters with a radio. Each kill was a calculation: elevation, drift, spin, humidity. But each one carried something heavier than physics: responsibility. These weren't numbers in a report. They were lives. They were sons, fathers, brothers, and every pull of her trigger meant another breath for the people trapped below. But the enemy was adapting. By dawn, they had begun shifting tactics, breaking into smaller squads, probing the perimeter, searching for her flank. Their movements grew bolder, more coordinated. And then came the sound every sniper dreads, the sharp crack of return fire that was too close. The round hissed past her ear, splintering stone inches from her cheek. Counter-sniper. She flattened against the earth, heartbeat thundering in her throat. Through the scope, she swept the ridge opposite hers, nothing. Then a flicker, a glint of glass, a muzzle shadow. Distance, 1,870 meters. Beyond her cartridge's optimal range, wind gusting crosswise. It was a bad shot, but it was the only shot. She steadied her breathing, letting the world contract. Every breath a count, every heartbeat a measure. Margaret's voice echoed in her memory: "Don't fight the wind, feel it." Talia felt it, the subtle lull between gusts, the quiet heartbeat of the storm, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet vanished into the void. 1 second, 2, 3. Then the glint was gone. "Overwatch, this is Echo 1. Enemy sniper neutralized. We're still pinned but holding. Extraction inbound in 20. She didn't smile. There was still too much to do. The minutes crawled like hours. Enemy reinforcements flooded the valley, 50, maybe 60 fighters. RPG fire streaked across the night sky, slamming into the safe house in concussive bursts. Through it all, Talia worked the bolt, chambering round after round, carving space into the enemy's advance. But ammo was running low, 12 rounds left, then 9, then 6. Echo 1 Overwatch, she radioed. I'm low on ammo. If extraction doesn't hit in 5, you're on your own. Copy Overwatch. Birds are en route. Hold if you can. She did. She held. Because that's what she had always done from the Derrick Valley to Alpha Ridge. She held when no one believed she could. She held when everything in her body screamed to quit. And then at last, salvation roared across the sky. Black Hawks, 2 of them. Their rotors thundered against the valley walls, door gunners unleashing streams of suppressive fire that ripped the ground apart. Talia tracked enemy positions and called them out over comms, guiding the extraction team in as if threading a needle through chaos itself. Move now, she barked. South wall clear, go, go, go. The CIA team burst from the shattered structure, dragging the wounded between them. Bullets cracked and whined around them, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. The first bird touched down, rotors kicking up a cyclone of dust and debris. 5 meters, 3, 1. The last operative scrambled aboard, and the helicopter lifted into the dawn. Overwatch, all assets secure, we're clear. Only then did Talia lower her rifle. Only then did she let herself breathe. Back at Bagram, the debrief was brief, deliberately so. Officially, the mission didn't exist. The names of those involved would never appear on paper. But as the CIA case officer shook her hand and thanked her for saving 6 lives that night, Talia felt something shift again inside her. It wasn't pride, it wasn't even relief. It was understanding. She had thought the valley would be her last mission, that saving Cole's team was the full stop at the end of her story. But now she realized that story had never been about endings. It was about choices. Choices to act when no one else would. Choices to step into chaos not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Choices to hold the line again and again for people who might never know her name. And those choices, they weren't done with her yet. Weeks later, back on the ranch, Talia found herself staring at the horizon again. The wind rolled across the plains, tugging at her hair, whispering the same lesson Margaret had taught her so long ago. You don't fight the storm, you move with it. Maybe the storm was her calling. Maybe it always had been. The phone buzzed against her hip. Another message, another mission, another choice. She closed her eyes and exhaled. And when she opened them again, there was no hesitation. She was ready. Because sometimes, destiny isn't a straight road. It's a series of crossroads moments where you decide, again and again, to step forward into the unknown. And Talia Grant had never been one to walk away from the unknown. The call came just before dawn, not a text, not an email, but a secure encrypted ping that bypassed every civilian channel. It hummed softly on the old satellite terminal in her study, the one she'd promised herself she'd pack away for good. The message was brief, stripped of pleasantries. Priority Alpha, immediate contact required. Langley. Talia stared at the screen for a long time, the morning light still a pale suggestion beyond the frosted windows. She just returned from the bulk operation. Her muscles still ached from the climb, and the faint echo of distant gunfire still lived somewhere in the corners of her mind. She had planned to rest, maybe take a week to mend fences, teach a new class, or sit on the porch with a pot of coffee and forget about the world. But peace, it seemed, wasn't part of her story. She keyed in the encrypted response. Minutes later, the voice on the other end was one she recognized. Not the clipped precision of a case officer, not the polished confidence of a commander. It was General Elias Warren, the kind of man who never called unless the stakes were too high to put into writing. Grant, he said without preamble, we need you again. By noon she was wheels up in a C-130, headed east. The mission was darker than anything she'd seen since Afghanistan, classified under a code name she'd never heard before, Operation Hollow Spear. And this time, it wasn't just a rescue. It wasn't even a simple overwatch. It was a ghost hunt. For the last 4 months, U.S. and Allied intelligence had been chasing the shadow of a new insurgent coalition, a network stitching together remnants of former Taliban cells with rogue Russian mercenaries and black market arms traders. They called themselves Al-Nal, the Bees, for the way they swarmed and vanished before a strike could land. And according to intercepted chatter, they had acquired something far more dangerous than small arms or mortars: man-portable anti-air missile systems. Dozens of them. It was only a matter of time before they tried to use them. The mission was simple on paper: infiltrate, observe, identify the leadership structure, and mark the site for a joint NATO strike. But the terrain was brutal, an arid labyrinth of valleys and ridgelines in the Badakhshan province, where local militias had built fortified compounds that even drones struggled to penetrate. Satellite imagery gave them outlines but no detail. They needed someone on the ground. And that someone, once again, was her. Insertion came under a moonless sky. A tiltrotor Osprey dropped her and a 4-man ISR team on a barren plateau 40 kilometers from the target site. From there, the rest of the journey was boots and breath, 72 hours on foot through hostile terrain, avoiding patrols, sleeping in shallow scrapes under camo netting. The nights were teeth-aching cold. The days were blindingly hot. But Talia didn't complain. She didn't know how. On the morning of the 4th day, they reached their observation post, a jagged escarpment overlooking the valley below. Through her scope, the compound came into view: crude mud brick walls topped with scrap metal, satellite dishes bristling like antennae on a beast back. Trucks rolled in and out under tarps. Men with rifles patrolled the perimeter. And in the center, half buried under camo netting, were the unmistakable silhouettes of missile crates. But there was something else. Movement. Not the frantic, sloppy kind of local fighters. This was disciplined, coordinated. She adjusted the magnification and felt her pulse kick. These weren't militia foot soldiers. They were trained, professional, Russian if she had to guess. And the man at the center, tall, broad-shouldered, his movements crisp and deliberate, wasn't a field commander. He was something worse. "Overwatch to command," she whispered into the mic. "We have a Tier 1 asset on site, possible foreign advisory element, uploading visuals now." "Copy, Overwatch," came the reply. "Hold position, do not engage." Do not engage, she knew those words. They meant, we're still figuring out how big this is. Don't start a war before we know who's playing. But as she scanned the valley again, her gut tightened. Something wasn't right: too many trucks, too much movement. And then she saw it, a convoy pulling up from the west, 3 vehicles with heavy armor plating. From the 3rd truck, a man stepped out in civilian clothes, surrounded by a wall of armed guards. Her breath caught. She recognized him. Anton Rakitin, former GRU officer, Russian Special Operations, wanted by Interpol for arms trafficking, assassination, and war crimes. Last sighted in Syria 5 years ago, and now, apparently in Afghanistan, shaking hands with Al-Nal. This wasn't a training camp, it was a summit. And it was about to change everything. For 12 hours they observed. Rakitin met with local leaders. Crates changed hands. Men shook on deals that would set the region on fire. Talia documented every detail: photos, coordinates, patterns of movement. But as the sun dipped below the ridgeline, something happened that no one had predicted. The compound began to empty. 1 truck, then 2, then 5. "Command, this is Overwatch," she said, voice low and urgent. "They're mobilizing. Repeat, they're mobilizing. If those crates go dark, we lose them." "Negative, Overwatch, stand by. We're awaiting strike authorization." "By the time authorization comes, they'll be ghosts." "Hold position, that's an order." She lowered the mic and stared through the scope, jaw clenched so tight it ached. Orders were orders, but she had learned long ago that following them blindly could cost lives. And there, in the middle of the convoy, was Rakitin himself, climbing into the lead vehicle. If he escaped, they'd lose their only lead on the missiles. The network would scatter, and the next time they surfaced, it might be in the wreckage of a civilian airliner. Her finger hovered over the trigger. She could take the shot. One squeeze, and the world would never see him again. But if she did, she could start a geopolitical firestorm. Russian involvement would become undeniable, and the mission, her team, might not make it out alive. The weight of that choice pressed against her chest like a physical force. Duty on one side, consequence on the other. And somewhere in the middle, the faint echo of Margaret's voice. The hardest shots aren't the ones you take. They're the ones you choose not to. Talia breathed out slowly and eased her finger off the trigger. Command, she whispered, marking the lead vehicle. If you're going to hit them, now's the time. The radio crackled. Then finally, authorization granted, strike inbound, 3 minutes. She marked the convoy with an IR laser. The seconds crawled like hours. Engines roared to life. Dust rose in spirals. The trucks began to roll. Then the sky split open. The first missile screamed in from the stratosphere, punching into the compound in a blossom of orange and black. The second hit the convoy's rear vehicle, flipping it end over end in a shower of fire and steel. Fighters scattered, shouting. Chaos swallowed the valley. Talia stayed locked in, calling targets for the gunships that roared in behind the missile strike. One by one, the vehicles burned. One by one, the missile crates detonated in thunderous blooms. But in the confusion, one truck slipped away, the lead vehicle. Rakitin's vehicle. Command, this is Overwatch. High-value target is mobile, heading northwest on Route Sierra Tango. Copy Overwatch. Drone coverage is limited. Can you track? Talia hesitated. I can do more than track. What followed wasn't part of the mission brief. It wasn't sanctioned. It wasn't even smart. But it was necessary. She and her ISR team broke down the op, moving fast along a parallel ridgeline, keeping the convoy in sight through gaps in the rock. The terrain was merciless, steep ravines, loose shale, switchbacks that punished every step, but they pushed forward, staying in the shadows. For 36 hours, they shadowed the fleeing convoy, feeding updates to command, calling in drone surveillance when weather allowed. Sleep came in broken fragments. Meals were cold ration bars eaten on the move. Every muscle burned. Every joint screamed. But they didn't stop. Not until the convoy stopped, deep inside a narrow canyon near the Tajik border. There, beneath layers of camouflage netting, was a secondary base, smaller, leaner, but no less deadly, and parked at its heart was the same lead vehicle, Rakitin's transport. She had him. Command, this is Overwatch. Secondary site located. Coordinates transmitting now. Copy Overwatch. We have your signal. Stand by for final strike authorization. She lowered the mic and stared through her scope, watching Rakitin step out of the truck, oblivious to the crosshairs resting just below his heart. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to think of the future. A future where people like him didn't hold the world hostage with weapons and ideology. A future where maybe, just maybe, her choices had tilted the balance toward something better. The strike authorization came 5 minutes later. And when the fire fell from the sky, it wasn't vengeance she felt. It was peace. By the time the dust cleared, Al-Nal was broken. The missile stockpile destroyed. Rakitin captured alive, pulled from the wreckage and handed over to international authorities. The network he had built for years unraveled in a matter of days. For most of the world, it was just another headline. Coalition forces foil major arms plot in northern Afghanistan. But for Talia, it was something deeper. It was proof. Proof that one person, one sniper, one woman once labeled a liability, could shape the arc of a conflict with nothing more than patience, precision, and an unshakable will. Proof that sometimes, the smallest decisions, a finger easing off a trigger, a choice to follow instead of fire, could change the course of history. Weeks later, back in Montana, Talia stood once again on her porch as the wind swept across the plains. The horizon stretched endless before her, the sky a canvas of fire and gold. Somewhere out there, new storms were forming, new battles, new choices. And she knew, when the call came again, because it always did, she'd be ready. Because strength isn't just about the shots you take. It's about the ones you choose to wait for. The snow had started falling again in Red Haven, soft and silent, blanketing the ranch in a thin layer of white. The world here seemed so far away from the chaos of bad action. No gunfire, no encrypted channels, no split-second decisions that could ignite wars. Just the wind against the barn walls and the steady rhythm of hooves in the pasture. And yet even here, the war found her. It always did. She first noticed it in small ways. A pickup truck idling too long at the end of the driveway. A drone civilian, maybe not, hovering on the horizon before slipping away. And then the email. No sender, no signature, just a single line in Cyrillic. You stole something that was ours. At first, Talia dismissed it as noise, the kind of empty threat that followed any high-profile operation. But the signs kept coming. A window in the barn shattered one night, no footprints in the snow. A package arrived at her gate with no return address, filled with nothing but an empty rifle casing. It was enough to make her tighten the perimeter. Cameras, motion sensors, a Glock by the bedside table. But beneath the precautions, there was something she hadn't felt in years, the slow, cold bloom of fear. The knock on her door came 3 weeks later, just after dusk. When she opened it, Nathan Cole stood on the porch, his breath clouding in the cold. He wasn't in uniform, hadn't been for months, but he carried himself like a man who still woke up before dawn to check his six. "Didn't expect to see you here," she said, stepping aside. "I wouldn't be if it weren't serious," he replied, his voice low. "Can we talk?" They sat in the kitchen, steam curling from untouched mugs of coffee. Cole set a slim black folder on the table and slid it toward her. "Intelligence picked up chatter on the dark net," he said. "Russian channels. They're not happy about Rakitin's capture. They're blaming you by name." "Let them," she said quietly, flipping through the folder. Surveillance photos, intercepted messages, bounties, large ones tied to her name and location. Cole leaned forward. "Talia, this isn't just talk. There's a contract out on you." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the wind rattling against the windows. "Are you saying I should run?" she asked finally. "I'm saying you should be careful, relocate, lie low until things cool down." She closed the folder and pushed it back toward him. "I'm done running." "Talia." "No." Her voice was calm, steady. "I spent 12 years proving myself to men who said I couldn't do the job. I spent 3 more proving I didn't need their permission. I'm not going to vanish because someone decided they're angry I did my job too well." Cole studied her for a long time, then nodded once. "Then we'll make sure you're not alone." For the next month, the ranch became a fortress. Cole called in favors from contacts across the special operations community. Former Rangers, retired SEALs, CIA security contractors, a rotating cast of men and women who owed her more than a few favors. They installed motion sensors in the tree line, reinforced the doors, mapped every approach and escape route. Talia tried to live as normally as she could, teaching classes, fixing fences, even attending the occasional town dinner. But the weight of unseen eyes followed her everywhere. Every creak of the floorboards at night, every unfamiliar truck in town triggered a flash of suspicion. She hated it, hated the way fear crept into the edges of her life. But she had learned long ago that control wasn't about eliminating fear. It was about refusing to bow to it. The attack came in early spring. It started with the power grid, a sudden blackout that plunged the ranch into darkness. Then the comms went down, phone lines dead, satellite uplink jammed, the cameras cut out one by one. By the time the first shot shattered the kitchen window, she was already moving. 3 shooters, Cole barked over the handheld. West tree line, maybe more circling north. Copy, Talia said, her voice calm, controlled. She slid into position at the second-floor window, her rifle already chambered and ready. The muzzle flash bloomed from the darkness. She caught it for a split second, adjusted and squeezed. One hostile down. Another took cover behind a fallen log. The third vanished into the shadows. 4 more approaching the barn, came another voice over the comms, suppressing fire. The night exploded into chaos. Muzzle flashes danced across the tree line. The crack of suppressed fire answered from the house. Someone lobbed a flashbang through the kitchen door. The explosion lit the room in searing white, but Talia was already moving, sliding down the back stairs toward the basement exit. The fight dragged on for nearly 20 minutes, 20 minutes of controlled chaos, of angles and patience and instinct. By the time the last shot echoed into silence, 3 attackers lay dead, 2 wounded and captured. The rest had vanished into the night. But the message had been delivered. This wasn't over. The interrogations yielded little. The men were professionals, mercenaries, not ideologues, and they knew nothing beyond their paymasters' vague orders. But one name came up again and again in snippets of chatter, half swallowed under layers of obfuscation. Mikhail Dobrev, a former Spetsnaz operative turned mercenary kingpin, ruthless, patient, and according to intelligence, the man who had orchestrated the bounty. Dobrev wasn't just after revenge. He was after reputation, and taking down the woman who had humiliated Rakitin, who had dismantled Al-Nal, would cement his as untouchable. "He's not going to stop," Cole said during the debrief. "He's going to come after you again, harder." "Then we don't wait," Talia replied. "We take the fight to him." Cole blinked. "You're suggesting we go on the offensive." "I'm saying I'm done waiting for them to knock on my door." There was silence for a long time. Then slowly Cole nodded. "Then let's build a plan." The plan was audacious, reckless, some would say. But Talia had never cared much for conventional wisdom. Dobrev operated out of a fortress compound in eastern Georgia, heavily guarded and insulated by layers of intermediaries. The key wasn't brute force. It was precision. Over the next 8 weeks, they built the operation piece by piece. Satellite passes, human leaks, financial backtraces. Every thread led to another until finally a gap appeared, a single weakness in Dobrev's perimeter. A supply convoy scheduled to transport weapons from Tbilisi to the compound. If they could intercept it, they could infiltrate the fortress under the cover of that shipment. From there, they'd have one chance, one clean shot to end this. And so, once again, Talia found herself halfway around the world, belly crawling through a ditch in the shadow of a convoy she had no business being near. The ambush was silent and surgical. A flashbang to disorient the drivers, a burst of suppressed fire to neutralize the guards. In less than 4 minutes, the convoy was theirs. Disguised as the shipment team, Talia and Cole rode the rest of the way inside the back of a covered truck. Hours later, the gates of Dobrev's compound groaned open, and the truck rolled inside. It was bigger than they'd expected, a self-contained fortress of concrete and steel, ringed with cameras and patrols. But the core was unmistakable, a central tower with a 360-degree vantage point over the valley below. That's where Dobrev would be. They split into teams. Cole and 2 others cut the power. Another pair sabotaged the comms, and Talia, rifle slung across her chest, pistol at her thigh, began the long climb to the tower. Every hallway felt like a heartbeat. every corner a question mark. She moved silently, a ghost in the dark, until she reached the final door. He was waiting for her. Dobrev stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, the faintest smile curling his lips. "I was wondering when you'd come." She raised her rifle. "This ends tonight." "Does it?" he asked softly. "You kill me and another takes my place. You dismantle my network and another grows in its ashes. Do you really believe you can stop what we are?" "No," she said, "but I can stop you." The silence stretched for a heartbeat. Then Dobrev moved fast, impossibly fast for a man his size. A hidden pistol cleared his jacket. A shot cracked through the air. Pain tore through her shoulder as she dove behind a steel column, her rifle skidding across the floor. He advanced, firing again. The round sparked against the column, biting into the concrete inches from her face. She gritted her teeth, reached for the pistol at her thigh, and rolled out from cover. One shot, two. Dobrev stumbled, eyes wide, the pistol clattering from his hand. He staggered back against the glass wall, breath shallow, a dark bloom spreading across his chest. "You think this changes anything?" he rasped. "No," she whispered, "but it's a start." The glass shattered under his weight, and he fell backward into the night. Extraction was chaos, alarms blaring, guards swarming, rotor blades chopping the air as their escape helicopter hovered over the compound. They rappelled down ropes under fire, engines screaming as they clawed for altitude. And then, as the fortress shrank into the distance, Talia finally let herself exhale. It was over. For now. Weeks later, back on the ranch, she stood again under that endless Montana sky. The horizon stretched wide and quiet, the wind cold against her skin. Cole stood beside her, a faint smile on his face. "You know they'll come again," he said. "I know," she replied. "Then why do you keep doing this?" She thought about it, about the ridge in Afghanistan, the convoy in bad action, the mercenaries on her land, the man who had fallen into the darkness. And she realized the answer had never changed. "Because someone has to," she said. The wind picked up, carrying her words across the open field, soft, steady, and unshakable. And somewhere in the distance, another storm began to form. The wind had a different sound in Montana after Georgia. It was softer, more deliberate, like the land itself was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. But beneath that quiet was a tension Talia couldn't shake. It clung to her like the smell of cordite after a firefight, like the faint ringing in her ears that never quite faded. Dobrev was gone. The network he'd built was shattered. The bounty had dried up. On paper, the war was over. But wars like hers never truly ended. They just shifted shape. It started with the nightmares. Some nights it was the Hindu Kush, tracer rounds clawing through the darkness as a young seal screamed for his mother. Some nights it was the safe house in Balk, where every shot she took echoed with the sound of bodies hitting the ground. And some nights it was the tower in Georgia, Dobrev's eyes, cold and defiant, even as the blood spread across his chest. They weren't memories, they were hauntings. And they didn't care how many lives she'd saved. Talia would jolt awake in the early hours, drenched in sweat, the phantom weight of a rifle in her hands. More than once she found herself standing at the window before dawn, scanning the tree line as if expecting muzzle flashes in the distance. "You need to talk to someone," Cole told her one morning over coffee. He had dropped by unannounced, just like he always did when he suspected she was retreating too far into herself. "I'm fine," she lied. "No, you're not." She tried to laugh it off, but the sound felt hollow in her chest. "You don't know me as well as you think, Cole." "I know enough," he said, leaning forward. "I know what it looks like when someone's still fighting a war that's already over." She said nothing. There was nothing to say. For weeks, she tried to outrun it. She threw herself into training, into teaching, into anything that kept her hands busy and her mind too tired to wander. The ranch became a blur of movement, fixing fences, restoring old rifles, teaching wind calls to eager students who hung on her every word. But no matter how hard she worked, the silence always caught up with her, and in that silence the questions returned. How many had she killed? How many lives had she saved? And did one ever truly cancel out the other? She had always told herself that what she did was necessary, that each shot was a thread in a tapestry of lives spared and futures preserved. But in the stillness of an empty house, the arithmetic stopped making sense. The visit that finally broke through her armor came in late autumn. She was in the barn, cleaning a rifle, when a truck crunched to a stop outside. She expected Cole or maybe one of the students, but the man who stepped out was neither. He was younger than she'd imagined, maybe 23, 24. A faint scar ran from his temple down to his jaw, and his hands shook slightly as he approached. "Are you Talia Grant?" he asked. "I am," she said carefully. "My name, Michael Tors." The name hit her like a sudden gust of wind. She knew it. She'd heard it before, not in person, but in a mission brief. Tors had been one of the SEAL operators pinned down in the valley, one of the 20 she'd saved. "I don't mean to intrude," he said quickly, as if already regretting coming. I needed to meet you." Talia set the rifle aside and gestured toward the porch. "Come on, let's sit." They sat in silence for a while, neither sure how to start. Finally, he spoke. "I don't remember much about that night," he said. "Just chaos, screaming, the sound of mortars getting closer. I thought we were done. I thought I'd never see my family again." He paused, his voice catching on the memory. "And then the shooting stopped." Talia said nothing. She didn't need to. "They told us later what you did, how far you were, how impossible some of those shots were." He looked down at his hands. "I don't know how to thank someone for giving you back your life." "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "Yes, I do," he insisted. "Because before that night, I didn't believe people like you existed, people who'd risk everything for people they didn't even know." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. A woman and a little girl smiled back at her from the faded print. "My wife, my daughter," he said. "She was 2 when I deployed, she's 5 now. She knows me because of you." Talia's throat tightened. She stared at the photo for a long time, her chest heavy with a feeling she couldn't name, something deeper than pride, softer than relief. Maybe this was what all the pain was for. Maybe this was the reason the nightmares were worth enduring. Tors wasn't the last. Over the next few months, others came. A CIA operative from the Balk mission, an Afghan interpreter who'd made it out alive because she'd held the ridge just long enough, a young intelligence officer whose drone team had escaped a valley ambush because of the overwatch she'd provided. Each story was different, but the message was the same: you saved me. And with each one, something inside her began to shift. She had spent so long thinking of herself as a weapon, a tool sharpened for a singular purpose. But now she began to see the truth. She wasn't just ending lives. She was protecting them, preserving them, giving them back to people who might have otherwise lost everything. Maybe that didn't erase the blood on her hands, but it gave it meaning. It was Cole who suggested the foundation. "You can't keep doing this forever," he said one evening, watching the sunset burn the horizon gold. "But you can make sure the next generation is ready when you're gone." At first she dismissed the idea. She was a soldier, not a philanthropist. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. She had knowledge not just about shooting, but about resilience, about survival, about carrying impossible weight and still moving forward. And there were people out there, veterans, young recruits, law enforcement officers who could use it. So she did it. She founded the Hale Initiative, named for her grandmother. Its mission was simple: to train, mentor, and support snipers, spotters, and overwatch specialists from every background, regardless of gender, and to provide psychological support for those haunted by the jobs that saved lives but took pieces of their souls in return. The program grew faster than she'd ever expected. Within a year, they had 3 campuses across the country and contracts with multiple agencies. And every time she walked into a classroom, every time she saw a young woman step up to the firing line without the weight of prejudice on her shoulders, she felt a quiet kind of pride, a different kind of victory. But even as she built something new, the shadows of her past lingered. Some nights they were softer ghosts watching from a distance. Other nights, they pressed close, whispering doubts into her ear. How many shots did you fire? How many men didn't walk away? What did it cost you to save them? On those nights, she'd walk to the edge of the property and look out over the plains. The wind would wrap around her, cold and endless, and she'd think about the choices she'd made, the lives she'd saved, the lives she'd taken, and the line that had always separated the two. And slowly, she came to understand something Margaret had known all along. The work wasn't about balance. It wasn't about redemption. It was about purpose. Purpose was the thread that held it all together. The reason she got up each morning, the reason she picked up the rifle again and again, the reason she faced the storm even when it would have been easier to hide from it. And for the first time in a long time, she was at peace with that. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned to molten amber, Cole joined her by the fence line. They watched the horizon in silence, the kind of silence that only exists between people who have been through too much together to need words. You ever regret it? He asked quietly. Every day, she said. And would you do it again? In a heartbeat. He nodded, and they stood there as the wind carried the weight of their shared history into the distance. Because regret and resolve were not opposites, they were partners, 2 halves of the same truth. And the truth was simple. Talia Grant had done things most people could never imagine. Some of them haunted her. Some of them saved lives. And all of them, every single one, had made her who she was. A sniper. A protector. A woman who had walked through fire and come out forged, not broken. And the world, she realized, was a little safer because of it. The call came at dusk, the kind that changes everything, even if you don't realize it yet. Talia was in the middle of a training session, adjusting a young recruit's stance behind a long-range rifle, when one of her staff walked up, phone in hand and face pale. "It's Langley," he said, "Priority Channel." Her stomach tightened. It had been months since her last operation, and in that time she'd told herself she was retired for good. But priority channels weren't about choice. They were about necessity. She took the call in her office, the walls lined with photographs of students past and present, some now law enforcement sharpshooters, others special operators. A legacy built one lesson, one breath, one bullet at a time. "Talia," the voice on the line said without introduction. It was Director Marshall, head of the Clandestine Services Division. "We have a situation, a big one." "I figured," she said evenly. "What's the target?" "Not a target, a hostage." That word made her freeze. The brief was short and brutal. A U.S. diplomat and 3 aid workers had been taken hostage in a remote part of eastern Turkmenistan by a splinter group calling itself Al-Fajr al-Jadid, the New Dawn. They were heavily armed, highly mobile, and known for executing hostages within 72 hours of capture. 36 hours had already passed. Satellite imagery showed the group moving the hostages toward a mountain complex near the Afghan border, a fortress built into the rock, nearly impenetrable. The terrain was too hostile for a full-scale assault. Air strikes risked killing the hostages. Negotiation had failed. They needed a surgical solution, a scalpel, not a hammer. And they needed her. She told herself she was done with field work, that her days of crawling through mud and silence were behind her. But this wasn't about politics or revenge or proving anything anymore. This was about lives. 48 hours later, she was back in a Black Hawk, flying low under radar over the barren plateaus of Turkmenistan. With her were 6 operators, a mix of Delta Force and CIA SAD, each one hand-picked for the mission. They had a single objective: breach the compound, eliminate hostiles, and extract the hostages alive. Talia's role was clear and simple. Overwatch. They inserted under the cloak of darkness, wind whipping against their faces as they fast-roped down into a dry riverbed 2 kilometers from the compound. From there, it was a grueling night march, silent and deliberate, weaving through jagged ravines and over knife-edged ridges until the fortress loomed above them, a dark silhouette carved into the stone. Talia set up on a crag overlooking the approach path. From this vantage point she could see everything: the entrance, the patrol routes, the watchtowers etched against the night sky. Her spotter, a young former Marine named Hayes, slid in beside her, glassing the perimeter through a spotting scope. 4 guards on the north wall, Hayes whispered. 2 with NVGs, 2 with fixed optics. Range: 850, winds pushing left to right at 9 knots. She adjusted the scope, her breathing slowing. The world narrowed until there was only the crosshair and the heartbeat beneath her cheek. First shot, 1 guard down. Second shot, another dropped silently. Third, fourth. The wall was clear. Paths open, she whispered into the comms. Move. The assault team moved like ghosts, slipping across open ground and hugging the shadows until they reached the outer wall. Charges detonated with muffled thumps, and the first breach was made. From her perch, Talia watched everything: calling positions, marking threats, laying down precision fire when needed. A pair of sentries on a high balcony crumpled before they could sound the alarm. A gunman rushing toward the breach never made it past the first step. Inside, the fight was brutal. The enemy was well-armed and well-trained, their defensive positions layered and deliberate. Hallway by hallway, the team pushed forward, clearing rooms, neutralizing resistance, moving closer to the hostages. But then something changed. "Overwatch, this is Echo 2, came the breathless voice of the team leader. "We've got a problem. They're moving the hostages." Destination: unknown, possibly deeper into the mountain. "We're losing them." Talia adjusted her scope, scanning the compound for any sign of movement, and then she saw it. A side door, half hidden in the rock, a trail of figures moving toward an underground tunnel. "Got 'em," she said. "They're moving east. 2 guards, 1 heavy with a radio pack. If they hit that tunnel, we'll lose them underground." "Can you stop them?" Her finger hovered over the trigger. The guards were moving fast. The angle was bad. And worst of all, the hostages were close, too close. "1 shot," she murmured. "That's all I get." She waited, 1 breath, another. The wind shifted just enough, she squeezed. The guard with the radio dropped, the others spinning in confusion. Hayes fed her quick data. She adjusted. Second shot. Third. The guards fell one by one and the hostages froze in panic. "Targets neutralized," she said. "Hostages are stationary." "Copy, we're moving to them." The extraction was anything but smooth. A heavy firefight erupted in the tunnels as the assault team engaged a secondary cell of fighters. Grenades rocked the narrow corridors. Echoes of gunfire rolled up through the stone and out into the night. Through her scope, Talia saw flashes of movement, hostiles trying to flank the team from the surface. She picked them off one by one. 800 meters, 900, 1100. Some shots she barely remembered taking, instinct and training blurring together into one fluid motion. And then the call came. "Overwatch, hostages secured. Exfil to Rally Point Charlie." But their problems weren't over yet. Multiple vehicles inbound from the south, Hayes said urgently, peering through the scope. "Technical trucks, heavy weapons. Looks like 30 fighters, maybe more." Talia's jaw tightened. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and dangerously exposed. "ETA on extraction?" she asked. 10 minutes, the pilot replied. "Maybe 12. "Not enough," she muttered. There was no time to think, only to act. She shifted positions, crawling forward to a secondary ridge with a better angle on the approach road. From here, she could see the convoy clearly, headlights snaking through the darkness like a serpent of steel and death. "Hayes, mark lead vehicle," she said. "Marked." She calculated the shot, 1,400 meters, full crosswind, moving target. A nightmare, but she'd done worse. She exhaled, squeezed, and the round smashed into the truck's engine block, erupting in a plume of fire. The convoy stalled, confusion spreading through the ranks. Gunners scrambled to set up heavy machine guns, too slow, too exposed. Shot after shot cracked into the night. Tires burst. Engines died. Men dove for cover as their advance ground to a halt. And still she fired methodically, relentlessly, carving chaos into their formation until the first helicopter appeared on the horizon. "Birds inbound," came the pilot's voice. 30 seconds. The team and hostages broke from the tunnel entrance, sprinting across open ground as rotor wash whipped the desert floor. Gunfire chased them, but Talia's bullets met each burst before it could find its mark. 10 seconds. Go, go, go. They boarded under fire, the Black Hawk lifting into the night with seconds to spare. The enemy's last volley tore harmlessly into empty sky. It was over. Back at base, the debrief was almost silent. No speeches, no medals, just quiet nods and weary handshakes. The hostages were safe. The team was intact. And once again, Talia had been the invisible thread that held it all together. But something about this mission was different. It wasn't the danger she'd faced worse. It wasn't the odds she'd beaten them before. It was the faces of the hostages as they stepped off the helicopter, tear-streaked, trembling, alive. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Hope. Weeks later, she stood again at the range in Montana, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Hayes was there too, now working full-time at the Hale Initiative. The students were packing up, their laughter carrying across the field. "You ever think about stopping?" Hayes asked quietly. "Every day," she admitted. "And why don't you?" She watched the last of the light fade, the sky a deep bruise of purple and gold. "Because the world doesn't stop needing people who will stand between chaos and those who can't." Hayes nodded. "You think they'll ever know, the people you've saved, the lives you've changed?" She smiled faintly. "I hope they never have to." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the prairie across the range. It was the same wind that had always followed her, from the valleys of Afghanistan to the deserts of Turkmenistan, from the blood-stained towers of Georgia to the silent fields of home. It whispered the same truth she'd always known. Purpose wasn't about glory. It wasn't about recognition. It was about doing the work, unseen, unthanked, unwavering. And as the stars blinked awake overhead, Talia felt that purpose settle deep in her bones. Because sometimes, the greatest victories don't happen in headlines or history books. They happen in the quiet, in the lives saved, the futures preserved, the darkness held back by steady hands and a steady heart. And hers had never wavered. The snow fell heavier that winter than anyone in Red Haven could remember. It came down in thick, silent sheets, coating the land in a blanket of white that muffled every sound and slowed the world to a patient heartbeat. Talia Grant sat on the porch in a heavy wool coat, a mug of coffee cooling between her hands, and watched the storm swallow the horizon. The wind was the same as always, restless, endless, but there was something different in how it touched her now. It no longer felt like a challenge to face or a warning to heed. It felt like a companion. She had spent years chasing storms. Now, for the first time, she felt content to let one wash over her. The world had changed in ways she couldn't have predicted. The Hale Initiative had grown beyond anything she imagined. 3 campuses had turned into 6, and students she had once trained now trained others. Agencies that once ignored her calls now sought her advice. The first 2 women had completed SEAL sniper school and were now deployed overseas. Others followed behind them, determined and unyielding, walking through doors that had once been sealed shut. And every so often, a letter would arrive. A handwritten note from someone whose life she had touched but would never meet. A mother thanking her for bringing her son home. A young woman telling her she joined the army because of Talia's story. A father who said his daughter watched her interviews before every competition match. The words were simple, but they carried a weight she could feel. You saved me. You inspired me. You made me believe I could. She kept every letter in a box in her study, a small, battered container that held proof of what she had once doubted, that one person's choices could ripple outward into lives they'd never know. Cole visited often now. They no longer talked about missions or intelligence briefings or the next crisis. Instead, they talked about quieter things, the price of hay, the best rifle scope on the market, whether the new generation of shooters was too reliant on technology. He looked older, a little grayer around the edges, but there was peace in his eyes she hadn't seen before. And in those conversations, Talia realized something she'd never said aloud. She wasn't angry at him anymore. Maybe she never truly had been. Anger had just been easier than admitting the truth, that, without his doubt, without his words carved like scars into her record, she might never have fought as hard. She might never have become the sniper who had stood on that ridge and changed everything. It was ironic, in a way. The man who had tried to close the door on her had, without meaning to, helped her blow it off its hinges. One evening, as the sun set the sky ablaze in orange and crimson, Cole asked a question that caught her off guard. Do you ever think about what's next? She laughed softly. Next? Yeah, he said. All this, the missions, the training, the legacy, it's bigger than one person. What happens when you're ready to step back? She stared out at the horizon, the snow turning gold under the dying light. I think when the time comes I'll know, and I'll walk away. And what will you do then? She smiled. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. Maybe I'll just sit here and watch the wind. But the truth was, she wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. Because there was still work to do. A new generation had begun to take shape under her watch, not just women but men too, who believed in something bigger than themselves. Shooters who understood that the job wasn't about ego or glory. It was about protection, responsibility, sacrifice. And with them came a shift in the culture she had spent her life trying to change. Evaluations stopped mentioning gender. Selection boards started measuring potential by skill, not stereotype. Young recruits no longer asked whether women could handle the job. They already knew the answer. The final mission of her career came quietly, almost without warning. No headlines, no fanfare, just a request, one last overwatch detail for an intelligence operation in a disputed border region. It was supposed to be simple. It was supposed to be routine. But missions like that never were. A small strike team had been inserted to capture a high-value target believed to be orchestrating attacks on coalition forces. The plan was clean. Hit the safe house, secure the package, exfiltrate before dawn. Talia's job was to provide cover from a ridge 1,200 meters away. It started smoothly. The team breached on time. The target was secured. And then, just as they were exfiltrating, the ambush hit. Gunfire tore through the night. Dozens of fighters poured from hidden tunnels, overwhelming the team's flank. Radios crackled with chaos. Voices shouted for help. Talia adjusted her scope, calm settling over her like a second skin. The world slowed. Every detail sharpened. The wind, the distance, the movement, it all became part of a rhythm she had known her whole life. First shot, second, third. Each one bought precious seconds. Each one shifted the tide. But there were too many angles, too many targets. And as she watched the enemy tighten the noose around the team, she realized there was only one way out. She couldn't stay on the ridge. She had to move. The climb down was brutal, loose rock, steep drops and gunfire snapping through the darkness. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Every step brought her closer to the fight, closer to the men and women whose lives depended on her. By the time she reached the valley floor, the team was pinned behind a crumbling wall, outnumbered and outgunned. She dropped beside them, breath ragged, rifle already shouldered. "Didn't think you'd come down here," one of the operators shouted over the gunfire. "Wouldn't miss the party," she shouted back. For the next 10 minutes they fought side by side, a last stand carved into the dirt and darkness. Talia moved with the fluid precision of a lifetime's training, every shot deliberate, every decision measured. And slowly, inch by inch, they pushed the enemy back. Finally, the thump of rotor blades cut through the chaos. Extraction birds swept in, miniguns roaring. The tide turned, the enemy scattered, the team moved. But as they sprinted toward the waiting helicopters, Talia stayed behind, covering their retreat. "Come on," someone shouted. "Go," she barked. "I'll be right behind you." She was. Not until the last man was aboard did she lower her rifle and run for the bird. And as the helicopter lifted into the night, the valley below fading into shadow, she felt something deep and certain settle inside her. This was it. This was how her story ended. Not with a medal, not with applause, but with duty, the same duty that had driven her from the very beginning. Months later, she retired quietly. No press release, no farewell speech, just a final entry in a classified logbook and a handshake from the director. The world would never know the details of her missions. Most of her kills would remain sealed in files that might never see daylight. But she was okay with that. Because the world would feel their impact in ways it would never recognize. On a warm summer evening years later, Talia sat on her porch again. The box of letters was beside her, a rifle rested against the wall, and the sky stretched endless above. She was older now, hair streaked with silver, joints aching with the weight of a life lived hard. But her eyes were the same, steady, unflinching, alive. Hayes had taken over the initiative, and new instructors had stepped into her place. Cole had retired too, finally buying the fishing boat he'd talked about for years. The next generation had grown into their own, strong, capable, unburdened by the battles she'd had to fight. The world was different now, better. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she could rest. The wind rose across the plains, cool and familiar, and she closed her eyes. In its song, she heard the echoes of everything she had been: soldier, sniper, protector, teacher. Every decision, every sacrifice, every life saved and every life taken. They were all part of the same story. Her story. And as the stars blinked awake above the endless Montana sky, Talia Grant, the woman once dismissed as a liability, the sniper who had saved 20 men when no one else could, let herself smile. Because in the end, it had never been about proving them wrong. It had never been about medals or glory or revenge. It had always been about one simple, immutable truth. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't argue. It doesn't demand to be seen. Sometimes dignity simply acts. And in doing so, changes the world.